Welcome to our deep dive into the world of cell injury. We're going to be looking at a YouTube video from Clinical Physio Insights all about inflammation and cell injury. It's kind of like taking a microscopic journey inside your own body to see what happens when things go wrong.
Yeah, that's a really cool way to think about it. I think this deep dive will give everyone a much better understanding of what happens at the cellular level when your body's dealing with like damage or stress.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think that there are these tiny battles going on inside us all the time. Like I'm always getting these little cuts and bruises, but I never really think about what's happening on a microscopic level. So I'm really curious to learn how our cells actually react to these challenges. The video starts off by talking about homeostasis. So can you remind us what that is?
So homeostasis is basically your body's way of maintaining balance, keeping everything running smoothly. Kind of like a well-run factory where each cell has its own specific job to do and, everything's working together harmoniously. When something disrupts that balance, like an injury or even just like chronic stress, those cells have to work harder to compensate and keep things functioning properly.
So even like everyday stress can affect our cells on a microscopic level?
Exactly. You
Yeah.
can think of it like carrying a small weight in your backpack. It might not feel like much at first, but over a long hike, that weight can really start to wear you down. The same principle applies to your cells. Small chronic stressors can add up over time and lead to bigger problems down the road.
That's a great analogy. I can definitely see how that would apply. So we've talked about homeostasis and this idea that our bodies are constantly striving for balance. But the video goes on to list a whole bunch of things that can disrupt that balance and cause cell injury, like everything from physical trauma to infections to genetic mutations. It's kind of overwhelming to think about all the things that can go wrong.
It really is. There's a huge range of factors that can cause cell injury. But for this deep dive, we're going to focus specifically on hypoxia and ischemia.
Okay, so hypoxia and ischemia, those are two terms that I've heard before, but I'm not entirely sure I understand the difference. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So hypoxia basically means a lack of oxygen to the cells. It's like cutting off their air supply. And ischemia is a lack of blood supply, which also means a lack of oxygen because blood carries oxygen throughout the body.
Okay, so they're both related to oxygen deprivation, and I imagine that can have some pretty serious consequences for our cells, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Without oxygen, cells can't produce enough ATP, which is their primary source of energy.
Right, ATP, the energy currency of the cell. I remember learning about that in biology class. But I'm a little fuzzy on the details. Can you remind us why ATP is so important?
Sure. Think of ATP as the fuel that powers all of the cell's activities, from muscle contraction to nerve impulses to protein synthesis. Everything the cell does requires ATP. When that fuel runs low, things start to break down. One of the first things to go is the sodium-potassium pump, which is essential for maintaining the balance of fluids inside and outside the cell.
Ah, the sodium potassium pump. That rings a bell. It's something to do with ions moving across the cell membrane, right?
Exactly. It's a protein that sits in the cell membrane, and it uses ATP to pump sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell. This creates an electrochemical gradient that's essential for a lot of cellular processes. When the pump stops working properly because there's not enough ATP, the cell starts to swell up because it can't get rid of excess sodium and water.
So it's like a balloon that's being overfilled.
Exactly. At the same time, acidity inside the cell increases because of the buildup of waste products, and its energy reserves continue to dwindle. This sets off a whole cascade of events that can ultimately damage the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cell.
The mitochondria, the organelles responsible for producing ATP. So it's like a vicious cycle. The cell can't produce enough ATP to power the sodium-potassium pump, which leads to a buildup of sodium and water, which further disrupts the cell's energy production.
Exactly. And eventually those damaged cells start sending out death signals, indicating that they're beyond repair.
Wow, that's pretty intense. It paints a pretty bleak picture. So basically, when cells don't get enough oxygen, it's like a domino effect where one thing leads to another and it all spirals out of control.
That's a good way to put it. But here's where it gets really interesting. The video points out that cells aren't just passive victims. They can actually adapt to these challenges in some pretty remarkable ways.
Really? So it's not always a one-way ticket to cell death.
Absolutely. Cells are incredibly resilient, and they have a variety of mechanisms to cope with stress and injury. The video gives some great examples of these adaptations. For instance, hyperplasia is when cells multiply to meet increased demand. Think of what happens during pregnancy or when your liver regenerates after damage. Your body is literally creating more cells to handle the workload.
So when I'm working out and trying to build muscle that's actually hyperplasia happening, my body is making more muscle cells.
You got it. That's a perfect example of hyperplasia in action. Your body is responding to the increased demand on your muscles by creating more cells.
That's so cool. It makes me want to hit the gym even harder. Now, what about when cells shrink? Like if you wear a cast for a while and your muscles get smaller, is that a type of adaptation too?
Yes, that's called atrophy, and it's another way cells adapt to changing conditions. It can happen due to things like aging disuse or even reduced blood supply. Basically, if a cell isn't being used as much, it shrinks to conserve energy.
So it's like the cell is going into power saving mode.
Exactly. Now, there's one more adaptation I want to mention. It's called metaplasia, and this is where things get really interesting. Metaplasia is when cells actually transform into a different type of cell.
Wait, so cells can actually change their identity.
That's right. It's like a cellular makeover. And it happens when cells are exposed to chronic stress or irritation. The video gives the example of a smoker's lungs, where the delicate ciliated cells that normally clear airways can transform into tougher but less functional squamous cells as a way of coping with the constant irritation from smoke.
So it's like the cells are trying to toughen up to survive in a harsh environment, but in doing so, they lose some of their original function.
Precisely. And this is what's so fascinating about cellular adaptations.
Hmm.
They can be both beneficial and harmful depending on the context. It's a delicate balance.
Okay, so we've talked about how cells can adapt to stress, but what happens when those adaptations aren't enough? The video goes on to describe the way cells die, and it makes a really interesting distinction between apoptosis and necrosis.
Yeah, apoptosis and necrosis are two fundamentally different ways that cells can die. Apoptosis is often referred to as programmed cell death. It's a highly regulated process where the cell essentially self-destructs in a very orderly and controlled manner.
So it's like the cell is following a set of instructions to dismantle itself.
Exactly. And the key here is that apoptosis causes minimal disruption to surrounding tissues. It's like a planned demolition where everything is carefully taken apart.
So what's an example of apoptosis happening in the body?
Well, think about the development of your immune system. When T cells are being educated in the thymus, the ones that fail their training are eliminated through apoptosis. This ensures that only the most effective T cells are released to fight off infections.
So apoptosis is actually a good thing in this case because it's getting rid of potentially harmful cells.
Right. It's a crucial process for maintaining a healthy and functional body. Now, in contrast to apoptosis, we have necrosis, which is basically uncontrolled cell death.
So if apoptosis is like a planned move, necrosis is more like a chaotic eviction.
That's a great analogy. With necrosis, the cell membrane breaks down, and the cell's contents spill out into the surrounding tissues, triggering inflammation and causing more damage.
So it's a much messier and more disruptive process.
Exactly. And the video goes into some pretty vivid descriptions of different types of necrosis, like liquefactive necrosis, coagulative necrosis, and fat necrosis.
Yes, it talks about liquefactive necrosis, where the brain essentially turns to mush, which can happen after a stroke. Then there's coagulative necrosis, where solid organs like the heart or kidney maintain their shape even though the cells are dead. And then there's fat necrosis, where pancreatic enzymes start attacking abdominal fat, which can actually lead to calcifications that show up on x-rays. It's amazing how different organs can have such distinct patterns of necrosis.
It really highlights the complexity of the human body and how different tissues respond to injury in unique ways.
Now, before we move on to inflammation, I want to touch on one last concept from the video cellular accumulations. Can you explain what that means?
Sure, think of it like neglecting your chores when you're overwhelmed with other things. Cells can accumulate substances they can't break down or eliminate properly. It's like their internal trash cans start overflowing.
Okay, that's a pretty vivid image. So what kinds of things can accumulate in cells?
Well, it can be a variety of substances depending on the cause.
Yeah.
The video gives some interesting examples, like fatty liver, where the liver gets overworked and can't keep up with fat metabolism, often linked to excessive alcohol consumption.
So it's like the liver's processing plant gets backed up.
Exactly. Then there's lepofusin, a pigment that builds up in aging cells. It's responsible for those brown spots we often see on older skin, a visible sign of cellular wear and tear.
Interesting. So those H spots are actually a form of cellular accumulation.
That's right. And then there's iron overload or hemochromatosis, where excess iron builds up in organs, which can be very serious.
Mhm.
And of course, cholesterol deposits, which contribute to atherosclerosis and heart disease.
So these accumulations can be pretty harmless, like H spots, or they can be very serious depending on what's accumulating and where.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It all comes back to that delicate balance that our bodies are constantly striving for.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground so far, from the basics of cell injury to the different ways cells adapt and die. But I think we're ready to move on to inflammation. What do you think?
Absolutely. Let's dive into that next.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've talked about how cells can get injured, and how they adapt and sometimes die. But now let's shift gears and talk about inflammation.
Or inflammation, I think most people associate that word with something bad, like, swelling or pain. Is inflammation always a bad thing?
Well, that's a great question, and it's understandable why we might have that negative association. But the truth is, inflammation is actually a vital part of your body's healing process.
So instead of being the problem itself, inflammation is more like a sign that there is a problem.
Exactly. It's your body's way of signaling that something's wrong and it needs attention. It's like your body's internal fire alarm going off.
Okay, so instead of being like the fire itself, inflammation is more like the fire alarm.
Precisely. It's a way of calling in the troops, so to speak, sending immune cells and resources to the site of injury to fight off infection and start the repair process.
So in a way, it's actually a good thing.
Exactly. In the right context and for the right amount of time, inflammation is essential for healing. It's a complex and carefully orchestrated process that involves a whole cascade of events.
That makes sense. So can you walk us through like what actually happens during inflammation?
Sure. So the video breaks down the acute inflammatory response into two main phases, the vascular phase and the cellular phase.
Okay, so let's start with the vascular phase. What's happening in our blood vessels during that initial stage?
So during the vascular phase, the blood vessels near the site of injury dilate, which means they get wider. This allows more blood to flow to the area, which is why the area gets red and warm.
Ah, so that explains the redness and warmth. I've always wondered about that. And what about
Yeah.
the swelling?
The swelling is caused by increased permeability of the blood vessels. So basically, the walls of the blood vessels become a bit leakier, allowing fluid and immune cells to seep out into the surrounding tissues.
So it's like the blood vessels are loosening up to let the good stuff through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That fluid that leaks out is called exudate, and it contains all sorts of helpful things like antibodies and white blood cells that help fight off infection and promote healing.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got the blood vessels dilating and becoming more permeable to allow for increased blood flow and immune cell delivery. What happens next?
That's where the cellular phase kicks in. This is where those white blood cells really take center stage. They're guided to the site of injury by chemical signals released during the vascular phase. And once they arrive, they get to work destroying pathogens, cleaning up debris, and releasing even more chemical signals to recruit additional help.
So it's like a well-coordinated attack plan with the vascular phase setting the stage and the cellular phase bringing in the troops.
Precisely. And there are different types of white blood cells that play different roles in this process.
Can you tell us a little bit more about those different types of white blood cells?
Sure. So we have neutrophils, which are like the first responders. They rush to the scene to engulf and destroy bacteria and other invaders.
But they're like the frontline soldiers.
Exactly. Then we have macrophages, which are more like the cleanup crew.
Mhm.
They arrive a bit later and focus on engulfing and digesting debris, dead cells, and any remaining pathogens.
Okay, so neutrophils are the first responders and macrophages are the cleanup crew. What about the other types of white blood cells?
Well, there are also lymphocytes, which are the key players in your adaptive immune response. They're the ones that can learn and remember specific threats. So, for example, when you get vaccinated against a particular virus, your lymphocytes are the ones that create those memory cells that protect you from getting sick again.
Ah, that's really interesting. So lymphocytes are like the intelligence officers of the immune system. They gather information about the enemy and develop targeted strategies.
Exactly. They're crucial for long-term immunity.
Hmm.
And then there are also mast cells, which release histamine, a chemical that contributes to the redness, swelling, and itching we associate with inflammation.
So histamine is the reason why my mosquito bites get so itchy.
That's right. Histamine is a powerful chemical that plays a role in both inflammation and allergic reactions.
Wow. It's amazing how our bodies have all these different cells working together to protect us. So we've talked about the vascular phase and the cellular phase and all the different players involved. But I'm curious about what triggers this whole process in the first place. How does our body know when to initiate an inflammatory response?
Well, the inflammatory response is triggered by a variety of signals, including damage to cells and tissues, the presence of pathogens, and even certain chemical mediators released by our own cells. For example, when you cut yourself, the damaged cells release chemicals that signal for help. These chemicals attract immune cells to the area and initiate the vascular changes we talked about earlier.
So it's like a distress signal that goes out to alert the immune system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the immune system responds by sending in the reinforcements to deal with the threat.
That makes sense. But what about turning off the inflammation? How does our body know when it's time to dial back the response?
That's a good question. The resolution of inflammation is also a complex process, involving a network of feedback loops and regulatory mechanisms. Basically, as the threat subsides and the healing process progresses, those chemical signals that were calling in the troops start to diminish, and the body begins to produce anti-inflammatory mediators that help to dampen down the response.
So it's like a balancing act between pro-inflammatory signals and anti-inflammatory signals.
Exactly. The body is constantly trying to find that sweet spot where inflammation is strong enough to deal with the threat, but not so strong that it causes unnecessary damage.
Okay, so we've talked about the different phases of inflammation, the roles of various white blood cells, and the signals that trigger and resolve the response. Is there anything else about the inflammatory process that you think is important for our listener to understand?
I think it's helpful to revisit those classic signs of inflammation that we all know: redness, warmth, swelling pain, and even loss of function. These signs are not just random events. They're actually part of a carefully orchestrated response designed to protect and heal the body.
Right. So when we experience those symptoms, we can think of them as signs that our body is working hard to repair itself.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really fascinating point. What happens when inflammation becomes chronic? That's where things can get really tricky and potentially lead to more serious health issues.
Okay, so we've been talking about inflammation and how it's like this double-edged sword. It's essential for healing, but it can also cause problems when it gets out of control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to dive into now, this idea of chronic inflammation.
Right, chronic inflammation. So what is it exactly?
Well, as the name suggests, it's inflammation that persists for a long time.
Yeah.
Weeks, months, even years.
So it's like the fire alarm keeps going off even after the fire is out.
That's a great analogy. And just like that blaring alarm can be really annoying and disruptive, chronic inflammation can wreak havoc on your body. It's been linked to all sorts of chronic diseases like heart disease, arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, and even cancer.
Wow, that's a pretty scary list of diseases.
So,
So what causes inflammation to become chronic in the first place?
well, there can be a number of factors. Sometimes the initial trigger for inflammation, like an infection or an injury, doesn't completely resolve. Other times it's our lifestyle choices that are fanning the flames, so to speak.
Okay, so things like what?
Things like poor diet, lack of exercise, chronic stress, smoking, exposure to environmental toxins. All of these things can contribute to a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation in the body.
So it's not just about avoiding injury, it's about making healthy choices that support our body's natural healing processes.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to understand the connection between our lifestyle and our cellular health.
Now, the video also mentions a few other interesting things related to cell injury and inflammation. Like, there's this term infarction that I've heard doctors use. What exactly is an infarction?
An infarction is basically an area of tissue death due to lack of blood supply.
So it's like a neighborhood losing power because of a downed power line.
Exactly. Those cells in the affected area are deprived of oxygen and nutrients, and they eventually die.
And I remember the video talked about the difference between red and pale infarcts. What's the difference there?
So the difference has to do with whether or not blood flow is restored to the area after the initial blockage. A red infarct, also known as a hemorrhagic infarct, occurs when blood re-enters the damaged tissue. So it's like having backup generators that can kick in when the main power goes out.
That makes sense. And what about a pale infarct?
A pale infarct occurs when blood flow isn't restored. So the area of dead tissue remains pale or whitish because there's no blood flowing through it.
Interesting. So the color of the infarct can actually tell doctors a lot about what happened?
Exactly. And it can also give them clues about the potential for recovery.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of cell injury and inflammation. We've learned so much about how cells respond to stress and how our bodies try to heal and protect themselves.
It's really amazing when you think about all the complex processes that are happening inside us all the time.
Yeah, it makes you appreciate the incredible resilience of the human body.
But it also highlights the importance of taking care of ourselves and making choices that support our cellular health.
So what are some things our listeners can do to promote healthy inflammation and prevent chronic inflammation?
Well, it starts with the basics: eating a healthy diet, getting regular exercise, managing stress, getting enough sleep. All of these things can make a big difference.
And avoiding things like smoking and excessive alcohol consumption, right?
Exactly. Those are definitely big ones.
It sounds like it's all about creating an environment where our cells can thrive.
Precisely. Giving our bodies the tools they need to function optimally.
Well said. And remember, this was just part one of the YouTube video series, so there's still more to explore in the world of inflammation and cell injury.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface. There's a whole universe of fascinating stuff happening at the cellular level.
Well, we'll have to save that for another deep dive.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. Thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure exploring the microscopic world with you.
It's been great talking with you.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We hope you learned something new and feel empowered to take charge of your health. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.